Disciplined that you came back early. We will go on now, and Christian, it's your turn, please. Yeah.
Which way does this go?
Fungerer det?
Does this work? Can you hear me? Not so good. Right, this version. Would that be better? Good. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm Christian Wetterberg. I work at the LEGO Group. I'm also the chairman of the European Toy Safety Standardization Committee, as well as the International Toy Safety Standardization Committee. And as you have seen, this part of 2 hours will consist of 3 different presentations: the safety assessment, the technical documentation, and the chemical requirements. And the idea is that I will start to talk about the technical documentation, and then Christina Larsson from the Chemical Agency will talk about the chemical requirements, and then I'll close with the safety assessment. So let's go for the technical documentation. You have already learned from previous presentations that the new directive contains clear definitions of what obligations or economic operators have, and also definition of those operators. Also, we have requirements for identification marking, technical documentation, declaration of conformity, safety assessment, etc. And then we have stricter safety requirements, in particular as regards the chemical requirements. Many of the other safety requirements were already introduced through standards, so it was more or less an update of the directive, although there are differences. So we will be looking into the 3 highlighted words here. And the technical documentation, some things have already been mentioned. I think it's unavoidable when you have many speakers that you will be overlapping to a certain part. But it is the manufacturer's obligation to draw up the technical documentation, and no one else's. Nobody can take over this, not the authorized representative or the importer or the distributor. And the basis is that it should contain all the relevant data used by the manufacturer to ensure the compliance of the product. It shall be, as mentioned before, in one of the official languages, and then it will depend on the market surveillance authorities whether they feel that they need a translation of the whole or certain parts into their specific language. And Per-Olof mentioned that in Sweden, English is considered to be an acceptable language. And then you have the recent request. Within 30 days, you should be able to present the documentation. And if you do get a request for translation, it's the same time frame. And then it has to be kept for 10 years. And the 10 years are, it applies to every single sample of a product, you could say. So when you place the last sample of a certain product on the market, thereafter you need to keep the documentation for 10 years. Now there is an annex, Annex 4 of the directive, which specifies the different elements which the technical documentation should contain. And we'll go through each and every one of these. But I would just like to mention a few terms first, so that we are in agreement what they mean. We often mention harmonized standards. And according to the directive, a harmonized standard is a standard which has been published by CEN, which is the European Standards Committee for Toy Safety. No, it's not. It's CEN is the general European Standardization Committee, and then we have a committee under CEN who deals specifically with the safety of toys. When CEN publishes a standard, all the members, that is all the national standard bodies, it's the Danish Standards, Swedish Standards Institute, etc., they are obliged to implement this as a national standard. That's why it's called a harmonized standard. When it's published, you know that within a certain time frame, it will also be the national standards in all the members of CEN, which is not necessarily the same, or it isn't the same as the members of the EU, because we also include EFTA members. So that's a harmonized standard. When a standard has been published by CEN under the Toy Safety Directive, it's also given to the European Commission, with a request to have a reference to that standard published in their official journal. And if the Commission considers the standard to support the requirements of the directive, they will publish such a reference. And when a standard has its reference published in the official journal, that standard gives presumption of conformity, meaning that if you comply with the standard, you're considered to comply with the directive for those areas covered by the standard. So those are two words, presumption of conformity and a harmonized standard. And then we also mention modules. Per-Olof already mentioned modules. And modules, you could say, are different conformity assessment procedures. And under the Toys Directive, we have two options. One is for the manufacturer to make, let's say, a self-certification, and then also be in control of the production. That's Module A. The alternative is to use a notified body to get an EC type approval, and then in addition be in control of your production. And those are two modules, B and C. So with those things clarified, I will also mention again the possibility to download, and it's already on your sticks, some very detailed information. For example, for the safety assessment, which is mentioned in one sentence in the directive, we have about 50-60 pages of explanations. So that shows you how complex it is. The first item in the list of the technical documentation is the detailed description of the design and manufacturer, also a list of components and the materials used in the toy, and also the safety data sheets on chemicals used. So we'll look a bit closer into that. The first one was the detailed description of the design and manufacturer, including a list of components and materials. So in practice, that would normally be a bill of materials. That would be the normal way within the industry to specify which materials you have used. So a bill of materials would be one of those items. A picture, which is clear enough to identify the product, and also if there are any markings on it, the picture should also show those. The packaging, that could also be a picture so that you can see that the appropriate warnings are on the packaging unless they were on the toy. The name and address of the manufacturer if that wasn't on the toy. The identification number. Any instructions and warnings. The age suitability, that is the when you use the standards, you need to know whether the product is intended for a certain age group, because different requirements will apply. So you need to indicate what the intended user age is. And you should also describe the manufacturing process. Does it include melting, cutting, molding, etc.? Now, the question is always asked, well, how detailed will it need to be? It's very difficult to give a general reply because the complexity of the toy will also affect the complexity of this detailed description. If there are many electric or electronic circuits, would be a need to present perhaps schemes of those. But if it's just a simple wooden cube, that would be a lot less information needed. So I can't say exactly how detailed it should be, but it should be possible for the authorities to identify the toy and to understand the intention. Yes, please. If you think it's of importance for your conformity assessment procedure, yes. The second part of the first item was the safety data sheets, where it says, as well as the safety data sheets on chemicals used to be obtained from the chemical suppliers. Now this is kind of a strange requirement because it doesn't limit the scope. So we did start slightly early, I think. Welcome anyway. Yes, the text of the directive doesn't limit this obligation to specific substances, and it doesn't mention what should be included in the SDS. And therefore, in the interpretation, which is in the guidance document, it's clarified that only when REACH would require a safety data sheet are you required to keep it as a manufacturer. And the REACH has a rather detailed description of when the safety data sheets are needed. That could be, would be, for example, for all substances on the SVHC list. If any of those are included, you would need an SDS. If the substances or mixtures are dangerous according to the applicable directive, that's another case. If they are persistent and bioaccumulative, that would be another case. And all those cases are listed in the guidance document. So the guidance document limits when you need to have an SDS. But you should remember that an SDS is often very useful when we later come to talk about chemical safety assessment, because it will tell you which substances have been used. The second item is in the technical documentation is the safety assessment. But since I'll have a separate presentation on that, I'll just jump over it for now. And instead look at item 3, which is the description of the conformity assessment procedure which you have followed. And I've already mentioned the two conformity assessment procedures, one of which is the self-certification, which is the normal procedure when you used the standards that are available. And the second one is the third-party verification. That's when you use a notified body. And I also mentioned that there will be modules that apply. Module A is for the self-verification, and Module B and C for the third-party certification. And self-verification is used when there are harmonized referenced standards in place which cover all the applicable requirements. Because as mentioned, they give then presumption of conformity. And the manufacturer, in order to know that he fulfills these standards, would normally perform testing. There is no requirement to have third-party testing, but it's quite common that you would use third-party testing because you wouldn't normally have in-house resources. But for the simpler tests, you might have, but often there would be third parties involved for the testing. You will need in your technical documentation either an external test report or a test report documentation from internally performed tests. You can't just say, well, I've done the testing. You need some type of test report or internal documentation of the tests that you have performed. And of course, one needs to carry out an analysis of the risk. We'll come back to that in the safety assessment to make sure that your product does not, or your toy does not have any other or present any other risk than those covered by the standards you have used. And then in addition, you need to make sure that the products you produce are at least as safe as the tested samples. The other route would be the mandatory third-party verification, and that's only required when either there are no harmonized standards covering the risks, or when you haven't followed those standards, or if you want to, you can always use a third-party verification, but you're obliged to do it if you have not used harmonized standards, or if the standards you have used do not cover all the risks. Item 4 is the declaration of conformity, and here it's required that you use the template which is presented in the TSD, in the Toy Safety Directive, in one of its annexes. There are 8 items and then a signature, and the directive says that you should use that model structure. And this needs to be in the languages to which the product is sold, in one of the official languages of each country. So if you sell to all EU countries, you will need 27 or, well, 23 different languages of your DOC. As mentioned before, you would have some time before you actually need to supply it on request, but it's supposed to be signed and in place before you place the product on the market. And there are cases when you can combine the DOC. It doesn't necessarily have to be for each single item number. Let's say you produce 3 items in 3 different sizes or 3 different colors, but they're otherwise identical. You can then include them in the same DOC, mentioning the 3 identification numbers. Then, of course, if one of those 3 versions is changed, you would need to revise your DOC. But that's just to mention that you can have a DOC that covers more than one item number. And this is the model structure set out in the directive. And on the same web page that you have received link to, I don't know if the document is also included on the USB stick, there is a full translation into all the official languages of this model structure. So if you need to write your DOC in other languages than Swedish or Danish or etc., you can find the translations. And basically what you fill in is only your name, an item number, references to directives or standards, meaning that those terms don't really need translation. It's only the text that needs translating. And it's quite well described also in the guidance document. Yes? Mm. In your technical documentation? Your declaration of conformity would, under point 5, that's where you would mention which harmonized legislation you are claiming to be in conformance with. So normally for toys it would be the Toy Safety Directive, but it could also be the EMC Directive, it could be the Radio and Teleterminal Directive, for example. Under point 6, you would then explain which harmonized standards have I used in order to show compliance with the directives I've mentioned. But there's no obligation to say when those tests were performed. But when you specify a standard, you need to specify the version that you have used. As you know, we now have, let's say, clean standards from 2011, but soon we will be seeing amendments to those standards. And every time an amendment is published, you need to consider whether your products are affected by that amendment. Let's say we produce an amendment on magnetic toys. Then, of course, if you don't produce toys with magnets in, you're not affected. So you could just make a note of that. You could still refer to the previous version of the standard. But if you are affected, then you need to update your DOC and refer to the newest version of the standard. But there's no obligation to mention test reports. And then we have the addresses and the places of manufacture and storage. And this applies also if those addresses are outside the EU. So that should be recorded in your technical documentation. And again, the address, as mentioned before, it's the addresses you use for the manufacturer, the importer, places of storage and manufacture should be an address to which you could send a letter. It needs to be a complete address. Item 6 is the copies of documents that the manufacturer has submitted to a notified body if involved. So this only applies if you have applied for and received an EC type approval. Then you need to include in your technical documentation the documents you had to supply to the notified body. And of course, if you have gone through that route, you would know which documents that would be. And that would be the following. Then we have the test reports and the conformity to production. And the test reports are the way through which you describe how you have ensured that you're in compliance. And if you do make your in-house testing, it's recommendable that you still use the accepted format, which is lined out in an ISO standard for testing laboratories, so that it's easy for the authorities to follow and understand. And as I mentioned before, you need to make sure that you include the reference to the latest version of the standard, or at least that you're in control that the latest amendment did not affect your product. So you should document that. If you have used the third-party verification, that is, if you have an EC type approval, then a copy of this should be included. And then you also need, in both cases, to show how have we ensured that our production is in conformity with either the sample you have self-certified or the sample you have received a type approval for. And also when it comes to ensuring the conformity of production, it's very difficult to give general answers because it will depend very much on the type of production. It's a matter of finding where things could go wrong and explain how you have controlled or minimized the risk that things would go wrong. If you, for example, use a glue to glue a small part onto a toy which is intended for children under 3, that would be critical for that glue to always be of the right quality. So that would be one item probably to check in the production. There could be several others, but it all depends on the toy you produce. What factors would you need to be in control of as a manufacturer? And again, there's a lot of information available also on the website of the European Commission. And I'll stop there for the technical documentation and open up for questions. I think it was obvious from the Danish authorities that it's important that you do have your technical documentation in place and that you know what it should include, since you will be asked when market surveillance activities are performed. Which? Last one? Okay. I think all the presentations are on the USB sticks, so you would find the link there as well.
I have a question. Is there any requirement on GMP, like a quality management system or something during production?
No, there's no requirement, but if you use one, of course, that would be a good way of showing how you ensure the conformity of production. But you can do it in other ways, so there's no requirement for ISO certification or that you implement a specific system. But it's of course a good idea if you know that the manufacturing site has a system in place.
I trust all of us are more or less challenged by the new directive, but one thing that surprises me is that we have 30 days to submit the technical files or the documentation, because isn't it expected that we have the technical files in place and in order before we send the product to the market?
Yes, but it's respected that that information could be in many different places, in many different systems within the company.
Yeah.
So the reason you have 30 days is not that you should start writing it. It's that you should be able to collect it from those different systems, put it together. If you're a distributor or importer, you might need to go back to the manufacturer, and everything takes time.
So it was just to clarify that, because it sounded slightly different. So thank you.
And also the directive does say that in cases of serious risk, the authorities can also request it in a shorter time. So this is more like a basic 30 days.
A question on language. The DOC, you said, has to be in the local language. Again, the Swedish authorities accept English language in the technical file, except for the DOC then, or?
Yep.
It depends on the authority, but in Denmark it is normally acceptable in English, the technical file as such. But it is up to basically those who write the national law. They can require it in the local language if needed.
More questions?
When it comes to national law, I should perhaps mention that personally I consider it easier to look at the directive and the guidance documents to the directive than in Sweden to read both the law and the ordinance and the three authorities' various detailed technical regulations. It's quite complex, the way it's been implemented in Sweden. And basically it's the same, apart from what Per-Olof mentioned, that we also include official public institutions in the requirements, not only the commercial activity. And that's why the guidance documents are so good, and they're translated.
More questions? Okay, you finalized?
Yes.
Thank you.
Så. Så. Okay. I will try to inform you about the chemical requirements in the Toy Safety Directive. My name is Kristina Larsson and I come from the Swedish Chemicals Agency. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to help to hold this presentation. I think that my agency is quite a new agency for you, so I thought I would start to introduce it. It's not so interesting picture, but it's just to give you some idea. The Swedish Chemical Agency, we are a national enforcement agency, and we have been working in the field of chemical products and chemical substances since we started in 1986. We're situated in Stockholm, and we're about 250 persons working there. And we are a chemical agency, and we have a long history to work with the chemical laws and restrictions. I think you heard about the REACH regulation and the classification and labeling regulations for chemicals. And that takes quite a lot of our power. We also are the national authority for the approval of pesticides and biocides. Those products have to be authorized before they're put on the market. And that's also a main area of our work. And since we are we are financed by the chemical industry, they have to pay to the government if they manufacture or import chemical substances and mixtures. So that's why we historically had worked with chemical products. But now we have a new our time are changing. The government has realized that chemicals in articles are also important. And I think the knowledge in the world increased that there is actually a problem with chemical in articles. So the last years we have been working with that area too. And we have some sector-specific regulations that has come into force. We have the Toy Safety Directive that I will tell you about today. And we also have the ROS Directive that some of you are affected of if you have electric toys. This chemical in articles is quite a new area for us compared to the chemical substances and classification and labeling. But we're learning. We have the chemical knowledge. And the Toy Safety Directive, we were an authorized authority last summer. And it's the first time that we are supposed to work with the CE directive and standards. So that's a new area for us. But we are learning. So that's short about my agency. And this is to illustrate how regulation works. Today I will tell you about the Toy Safety Directive and the chemical requirements there. But we have sector-specific regulations like the Toy Safety Directive for toys. We also have a directive for chemicals in electric and electronic equipment, the ROS directive. And that's sector-specific for electric equipment. But sometimes an article, a toy, it can be both a toy and an electronic equipment, like a remote-controlled car. Then it has to comply with both those directives. And then we also have some general chemical legislation, like we have the REACH regulation with some restrictions. I think most of you are familiar with the phthalates that are not allowed to be used in toys. And that's not regulated in the Toys Directive. It's regulated in the REACH regulation. And then we have some toys that are considered to be cosmetic products. We have the tattoos, temporary tattoos. We have cosmetics for dolls. And that is a toy, so it has to comply with the Toy Safety Directive. But it's also a cosmetic product, and then it has to comply with the Cosmetic Directive as well. And we also have some legislation for classification and labeling. And that's applicable if you have a chemical or a toy that is also a chemical substance or a chemical mixture, like we have the finger paint, for example. If it contains hazardous substances, it has to follow the criteria for classification. But today I will tell you about the specific chemical requirements in the Toy Safety Directive. But I think it's good to know that you have to comply with all of these chemical requirements. And you have been told this before. In the directive, we have some basic requirements, and we have some general basic requirements, and we have some more specific general requirements for the chemicals. But it states that toys has to be safe, and it also considers the chemicals that they contain. And if we make a comparison with the new directive and the old directive, you heard before that the chemical part of the new directive, it enters into force next summer. So today you have to comply with the chemical requirements of the old directive. And in the old directive we have a maximum migration of 8 elements from the toys. And that you can make sure that you comply with by testing to the standard. I think you're quite familiar with that. But in the new directive, there are more specific chemical requirements. Now we have 8 elements, and next summer it is 19 elements that has a maximum migration. And we have some very hazardous substances. They're called the CMR substances. They can cause cancer, they're mutagenic or reproductive. And there is a general ban for toys to contain those substances. And we have some fragrances that we know from the cosmetic legislation that they are allergenic. And they will not be allowed to be used in toys either. The most allergenic ones will be banned, and then we have a duty to inform for 11 more of those substances. And we will also have regulation for nitrosamines and nitrosable substances in certain toys. And as Christian said, you have to make a chemical safety assessment. So it will be quite more complicated for you. Although we have the general requirement that toys has to be safe. So you should fulfill these new bans already, I think, to make sure that the toys are safe. Since we know they're not either. I think I should go into detail into those different restrictions and tell more in detail what it means. We have the basic chemical requirements that states that toys has to be that toys has to be designed and manufactured in such a way that there is no adverse risk for human health. And how can you make sure that you comply with this? There is this chemical safety assessment that you has to perform. And here you must make sure that what possible hazardous chemicals is may be present in my toy, and do they pose any risk to the user. And it can be like if you have a toy made of PVC. Oh, it might contain phthalates, and some of the phthalates are banned. And then you must make sure that they are not part of the toy to be assured that it complies with the regulation. But this is the basic chemical requirement. Then we have a reference to the first picture I showed you with all the other legislation. It says that toys shall comply with relevant community legislation to certain categories of toys. And I told you, REACH is a general legislation. We have bans of, for example, azo dyes in textiles. So all textiles are not allowed to contain certain azo dyes. But we also have in REACH restrictions like toys are not allowed to contain phthalates, or toys are not allowed to contain benzene. So in REACH you have also some restrictions that are only applicable for toys. We have like the classification and labeling system for chemical toys. And I told you about ROS in the Cosmetic Directive. Then we have the chemical properties in entry 2. It states that if a toy itself is a mixture or a substance, it has to comply with the classification and labeling legislation. And I think you're familiar with the symbols in the corner. You used to see them on chemicals. So if you have, for example, a finger paint and it contains a substance that meets the criteria for classification, then you have to label the finger paint with the applicable symbol and applicable phrases. But I don't think many toys will be needed to be classified because they should be safe. I think this is most applicable for chemical experiments and such kind of products. And also I can tell you that if you don't know the classification of the substances that you have in your product, we have the European Chemical Agency, ECHA. They have an inventory where manufacturers and importers, they report the classification of all the substances that they put on the market. So if you have a substance that you're not sure how to classify, then you can look into their webpage and get that information. I told you that there is a specific ban for CMR substances, and those are very hazardous. We don't want children to be exposed to substances that might cause cancer or be mutagenic or reprotoxic. And here for this ban, there is also reference to the classification and labeling legislation. Because in the classification and labeling legislation, there is a limit, a concentration that triggers the classification. If you have a substance present above a certain limit, you have to classify the mixture. And that level for classification, it depends on the severeness of the substance. And if you have a substance that you know it will cause it will cause cancer, then you are allowed to have a lower concentration than if you have a substance that you're not so sure that it will cause cancer. And that's why the substances are divided into different categories. We have the category 1A, 1B, and 2. And as you can see, for the category 1A and 1B, you're only allowed to have 0.1%, whereas for category 2, you're allowed to have 1%. And it's because the 1A and 1B, they will cause, you're sure that it will cause these effects. I think I just made it more confusing for you. Did you understand what I said? It's so difficult to explain. But I would recommend you to be sure that you don't have these substances in your toys, even though you are allowed. And again, if you don't know if a substance fulfills the criteria for classification as CMR or not, you can look at this inventory at the European Chemical Agency's webpage, because there you can see how the substances are classified. Then we have a specific restriction for nitrosamines and nitrosable substances in the directive. And nitrosamine, they're also carcinogenic. And they give these effects in very low concentrations, and therefore there is a specific limit for these substances. And you see we have the nitrosamines, and we have nitrosable substances that are substances that can form nitrosamines. And we have different limits. We have 0.05 milligram per kilogram for nitrosamines and 1 milligram per kilogram for nitrosable substances. And these are not banned in all toys. It's in toys for children under 3 years and in toys intended to be placed in the mouth. And I think you're all familiar with the Rupic systems. And these substances has mostly been found in balloons, I think, from market surveillance authorities anyway. Maybe you find them in other toys as well. So they're mainly found in rubber materials, but also in finger paints. And you have to be extra sure that you don't have these substances. And there is a standard being prepared to help you to show that you comply with this ban. Then we have cosmetic toys. They have to comply with the Toy Safety Directive, but they also have to comply with the legislation for cosmetic products. That is, they have specific labeling requirements, and they also have specific compositional requirements. So you have to make sure that if you have, for example, a cosmetic for dolls, that it's not only fulfills the legislation in the Toy Safety Directive, it also has to comply with the cosmetic legislation. Then we have the allergenic fragrances. In the directive there is a ban for 55 allergenic fragrances, and there is a labeling requirement for 11 more substances. And these substances, they're also restricted in some way in the cosmetic directive. But it's not the same restriction in that directive as in the Toy Safety Directive. So the first of the 55 that are banned in the Toy Safety Directive, the first 40 are banned in the Cosmetic Directive. And then there is a labeling requirements for the other 26. So 15 of the substances that are only requires a labeling in the Cosmetic Directive, they're actually banned in the Toy Directive. I think that's important to remember also, to not say that I don't want cosmetics that is banned in the Cosmetic Directive or fragrances, since then it may not comply with the Toy Safety Directive. And there is also an exemption from the fragrances ban, and that if you have olfactory board game and Gustav kits or cosmetic kits, then you're allowed to use 15 of the banned chemicals, the fragrances. But then you have to name the fragrance on the package, and also to have the warning contains fragrances that may cause allergies. I don't know if you make this kind of toys. I think they're not so big in Sweden. Then we have the migration of elements. I said that we have migration of elements today, but only of 8 elements, and those are the ones that are red here. It's also a migration limit for chromium today, and in the new directive we have chromium 3 and chromium 6 instead. So these substances are not allowed to migrate from the toys above a certain level. And there are specific migration limits for all the elements. So there is one migration level for antimony and another one for arsenic. And also there are different migration limits for different materials. Toy materials has been divided into 3 groups. We have the dry, brittle, powder-like materials, liquid and sticky toy material, and scrape-off material. And depending on what material the toy is made of, then you have the different migration limits. And a lot of these elements, they are also CMR substances, and then you have to comply with the strictest limit, and it's usually the migration limit. So in summary, the chemical requirements, they will enter into force in July next summer. And it's important to remember that toys also has to comply with other chemical requirements. That's what I was going to say. Do you have any questions?
I think this challenge has to be discussed. So I'm sure you have some questions. Yes.
When the toy directive was implemented, or in front of that, there was a group from the European community that went to China to train the industry in China and prepare them. Will there be something similar when the chemical rules are being implemented?
I know that they go to China every now and then.
Okay.
They have this cooperation, and they try to educate industry
how
to comply with.
Yeah.
I don't know if they invite everyone or they do. Okay.
Okay.
But I know that they go there every now and then.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other
Everything
questions?
was crystal clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
In REACH, the list of SVHC, can you automatically say that they will be forbidden in toys when the new directive come into force next year, caused by the CMR ban?
If you look at the candidate list, you mean?
Yes.
In the candidate list, you have substances that are either CMR, but they can also be hazardous to the environment.
Okay.
So I think today most of the substances are CMR, but some of them are hazardous to the environment. But we have, if you look at our webpage for the chemical agency, you can see why they are on the candidate list. And also you can get information about what kind of products you usually find them in. I don't know if you're familiar with this list. Okay, I see the note.
Are all the different limits of the new substances decided so we can start testing already? Or when will it be done?
Maybe I should have mentioned that, because if you look here, like I said, we have maximum migration limits for 19 elements, but there is a possibility to change the limits. And it has been done for cadmium since the directive was decided. And there is discussions going on for barium and also for lead. So these limits will change. Whenever there is new data coming up that a substance is more hazardous than you know today, then there is a possibility to revise the limits. And also there is a possibility for the allergenic fragrances. If a new fragrance is limited in the Cosmetic directive, it's also a possibility to limit it in the Toy Safety Directive. And we also have a list that is empty today, where it is possible to put, if you have a substance that you know may cause harm in lower concentrations than the, for example, the general CMR ban, then it's a possibility to add the substance in the Annex C with the specific concentration limits, but it will only be applicable for toys for children under 3 years of age. So there are possibilities to change the directive.
I think in addition we should just mention that a standard is being developed for testing those 19 elements for migration.
Yes.
So it will be a new version of the EN 71 part 3. So even though the limits are known today, we do not have a working standard that you can go out and test after. But that will be hopefully in place before the deadline next summer. And the same for nitrosamines and nitrosable substances. It will be named EN 71 part 12, I believe. Yeah.
And if the standard is not ready, what are we going to do?
I think everyone is working to make sure that there is a standard present. I think Christian can tell you more about that. But otherwise, I think it is. You have to make sure that you have lots of toys in stock to sell until there is a standard.
Right now, testing in different test labs, we get different results.
Yes.
So if we don't have a standard, I would be quite out of work.
I think everybody wrote down what you said about the stocks. More questions?
I have a question regarding the organic chemicals in EN 71 part 9. As far as I know, that standard is not harmonized, correct? However, there are known risks. Does that mean that we need type examination?
I don't think you need, because the substances in EN 71.9, they are CMR substances, I think, most of them.
There's BPA and so on as well. Not all of them are CMR.
They are CMR, but maybe category 2. You will have the general CMR ban, and also there is that standard will be revised, but it will be revised after the ones that the Commission has given a mandate to update. And tricky. I think we have to consider if you have maybe It's difficult to. You don't know what will happen. Maybe Christian has a better answer. Mm. Mm.
But you cannot see the program. Christian is coming back soon here and come up with more information for all of us. Any more questions just now? Or should we? Thank you very much. I think it's after lunch. We are a lot of people in a small room. So everybody please rise. And you have 5 minutes break. Just 5 minutes. And then we will go on. Christian will come back and inform us.